If you think violence only exists where cameras are present, this story will challenge everything you believe. What you're about to hear is not a rumor, not a myth, but a reality lived in silence. Stay with us until the end, because every chapter reveals how fear becomes law. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe, turn on notifications, and join this channel. Your attention keeps these truths alive, and the next story is already unfolding. Mathare is not a place that appears on postcards. It does not exist in official tourism campaigns, nor in the polished narratives of Nairobi as a rising global city. Yet within this dense maze of corrugated metal roofs, open sewers, and narrow passageways, more than 500,000 people live compressed into one of the smallest urban spaces in Kenya. Mathare is not simply poor, it is structurally abandoned. The state exists here only as an idea, something spoken about on the radio or promised during elections, but rarely felt in daily life. Police patrols are sporadic and often predatory. Public services are almost non-existent. In this vacuum, power does not disappear, it mutates. From the earliest hours of the morning, Mathare moves according to its own rhythm. Water is fetched from illegal connections controlled by unseen hands. Electricity flows through tangled cables, suspended like spiderwebs above the alleys, paid for not to a utility company, but to local enforcers. Public transport routes entering and leaving the slum are regulated not by municipal authorities, but by young men who answer to something older, deeper, and far more feared. This is the environment in which Mungiki did not merely appear, but became necessary to some and terrifying to all. Mathare's relationship with the Kenyan state has long been defined by neglect and repression rather than protection. When residents speak of authority, they do not describe institutions, they describe individuals. Names whispered, faces remembered, boundaries understood without signs. In the absence of reliable governance, communities are forced to negotiate survival on their own terms. Informal justice replaces courts. Informal taxation replaces public funding. Informal security replaces the police. It is here that Mungiki learned its first and most important lesson. Fear works when law does not. To understand why Mungiki could root itself so deeply, one must understand Mathare not as chaos, but as order without legitimacy. Every space is controlled, every resource contested. When the government failed to provide clean water, someone else stepped in. When electricity became a privilege instead of a right, someone else regulated it. When residents could not rely on the police to protect them, someone else offered security at a price. Mungiki did not arrive announcing terror. It arrived offering structure, discipline, and identity in a place stripped of all three. For many young men growing up in Mathare, the path ahead is brutally narrow. Education is fragmented, employment is scarce, respect is earned through force or allegiance. Mungiki presented itself as a brotherhood that promised belonging in a society that had already excluded them. It spoke the language of tradition, invoking pre-colonial Kikuyu identity, purity, and resistance to Western corruption. In a community shaped by humiliation and survival, this message did not sound radical. It sounded familiar. Mathare's geography itself aided this transformation. The labyrinthine layout makes surveillance difficult and control intimate. Outsiders are immediately visible. Strangers are noticed. Information travels faster than police vehicles. This allowed Mungiki to operate openly in some areas and invisibly in others, blending into daily life while slowly asserting dominance. What began as cultural gatherings evolved into organized enforcement. Disputes were settled quickly, punishments were public. The message spread not through speeches, but through silence, the kind that follows fear. As Mungiki tightened its grip, the state responded not with reform, but with force. Police raids became more frequent, more violent, and often indiscriminate. Entire neighborhoods were punished for the presence of a few. Young men were arrested without charges. Bodies appeared after nighttime operations. Instead of weakening Mungiki, these actions reinforced its narrative that the government was an enemy and survival required loyalty to something else. Each raid became recruitment propaganda. Each killing deepened resentment. Residents of Mathare found themselves trapped between two powers that did not protect them. On one side, a government that appeared only to punish. On the other, a sect that demanded obedience but offered order. Choosing neutrality was not an option. Silence was interpreted as defiance. Cooperation was interpreted as betrayal. Daily life became a negotiation with invisible rules enforced by visible consequences. By the time Mungiki's presence became undeniable to the wider public, Mathare had already been transformed into a testing ground. What worked here could work elsewhere. Control of transport routes expanded beyond the slum. Extortion systems refined in Mathare were exported to other parts of Nairobi. The slum was no longer just a place of origin. It was a laboratory for power without accountability. Yet for all its brutality, Mungiki's rise cannot be understood without acknowledging the conditions that allowed it to grow. Mathare was not conquered, it was abandoned first. When people are denied dignity long enough, they stop asking who rules them and start asking who feeds them, who protects them, who punishes those who threaten them. In that question lies the true danger, because once fear replaces legitimacy, leaving that system becomes nearly impossible. This is where the story truly begins. Mathare is not just the backdrop of Mungiki, it is the reason the group could exist at all. Before the beheadings, before the oaths, before the declaration that leaving only happens through death, there was a place where the state vanished and something else stepped in. To understand Mungiki, one must first understand Mathare, not as a slum, but as a warning. Before Mathare knew Mungiki as a name spoken in fear, it knew it as a promise. The group did not emerge wearing the mask of terror. It arrived speaking the language of restoration, identity, and belonging. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, Kenya was undergoing a deep moral and political fracture. Economic hardship intensified, corruption became normalized, and the distance between ordinary citizens and the ruling elite widened dramatically. For many young Kikuyu men, particularly those displaced to informal settlements like Mathare, the nation felt stolen, not only economically, but spiritually. It was in this climate that Mungiki began as something radically different from how it would later be known. The name itself, often translated as the multitudes or the masses, carried a collective identity rather than a criminal one. Early adherents described the movement as a return to traditional Kikuyu values, rejecting Christianity, Western dress, and what they viewed as moral decay introduced through colonial rule and post-independence elites. Ritual cleansing, traditional prayers, and communal discipline formed the core of its early structure. This was not initially a movement born in Mathare alone. Its roots stretched into rural central Kenya, where land dispossession, youth unemployment, and political marginalization had already created fertile ground for radical ideas. But Mathare became the perfect urban vessel. The slum offered anonymity, density, and a generation of young men searching for meaning in a city that offered none. What Mungiki provided was not merely belief, it provided certainty. The transformation from cultural revival to armed sect did not happen overnight. It occurred through a gradual hardening of ideology. As members adopted stricter codes of behavior, obedience became inseparable from identity. Hairstyles, clothing, language, and diet were regulated. Christianity was denounced as a tool of submission. Loyalty to the group was elevated above loyalty to family, state, or self. What began as resistance evolved into isolation. As the group grew, so did its confrontation with authority. Kenyan security forces viewed Mungiki not as a cultural movement, but as a threat to public order. Crackdowns intensified, especially as the group refused to register, formalize, or submit to political oversight. Arrests were frequent, often violent. Meetings were disrupted. Leaders were detained or disappeared. Each act of repression reinforced Mungiki's worldview that the state was hostile, corrupt, and irredeemable. This is the moment where ideology began to militarize. Survival required secrecy. Secrecy required discipline. Discipline required enforcement. Internal dissent was no longer tolerated as debate. It was reframed as betrayal. Rituals that once symbolized unity became tools of control. Oaths became irreversible, punishments became exemplary. Violence, at first defensive, soon became instructional. Mathare played a crucial role in this shift. The slum's proximity to Nairobi's transport arteries exposed Mungiki to informal economies that demanded regulation. Control over Matatu routes, protection rackets, and access to water infrastructure introduced financial incentives that ideology alone could not provide. The movement faced a choice: remain purely spiritual and fade, or adapt and dominate. It chose dominance. By the late 1990s, Mungiki was no longer just preaching resistance, it was enforcing it. Members trained in coordinated action. Hierarchies hardened. Commands flowed downward without explanation. The language of tradition was now fused with the language of force. Cultural revival had become a vehicle for obedience, and obedience had become a weapon. This evolution did not alienate the community as much as outsiders might expect. In places like Mathare, where law had failed, Mungiki's structure appeared functional. Disputes were resolved quickly. Theft within controlled areas dropped. Order, however brutal, replaced uncertainty. Residents paid not because they believed, but because they understood the alternative. Fear became governance. At the national level, politicians oscillated between condemning Mungiki and quietly exploiting it. During periods of unrest, especially around elections, the group's capacity for mobilization made it useful. Alliances were whispered, denied, and forgotten. For Mungiki, this ambiguity validated its sense of power. It was feared by the state, courted by politicians, and obeyed by communities. The transformation was complete. What began as a spiritual rejection of Western influence had become something far more dangerous, a closed system where identity justified violence and violence preserved identity. Leaving the group was no longer a personal choice. It was a violation of sacred order. Death ceased to be a consequence and became a rule. By the time Mungiki entrenched itself fully in neighborhoods like Mathare and extended its reach across Nairobi, its original message was almost unrecognizable. Tradition remained in name, but terror was now the language. The group no longer needed to convince, it only needed to remind. This transformation explains why Mungiki cannot be understood simply as a gang or criminal organization. It is the product of ideology weaponized by abandonment, repression, and opportunity. Its brutality is not random, it is structured. Its fear is not accidental, it is intentional. And its origins, once framed as cultural revival, now serve as proof of how easily belief can become a prison. The path from revival to armed sect is not unique to Mungiki, but in Mathare it became irreversible. Because once ideology fuses with survival, and survival demands violence, there is no return to innocence, only escalation. Once Mungiki crossed the threshold from belief to enforcement, the movement required a new kind of loyalty, one that could not be withdrawn. This loyalty was not secured through persuasion alone, but through ritualized fear. What bound members to the group was not simply ideology, but a system of psychological captivity engineered to erase the possibility of exit. At the center of this system were the oaths. Initiation into Mungiki was never symbolic. It was invasive, deliberate, and irreversible by design. New recruits were subjected to ceremonies conducted in secrecy, often at night, far from the eyes of outsiders. These rituals blended distorted interpretations of Kikuyu tradition with calculated psychological manipulation. Blood was frequently involved, sometimes animal, sometimes human, to seal the oath. The act was not about spirituality. It was about crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. The oath did not merely demand loyalty, it redefined identity. Once sworn, the individual no longer belonged fully to their family, their community, or themselves. They belonged to Mungiki. The language used during these rituals reinforced this transformation. Words associated with death, ancestors, and curses were invoked to instill the belief that betrayal would not only result in physical punishment, but spiritual annihilation. Fear extended beyond life itself. This is how Mungiki ensured obedience even in the absence of constant surveillance. Members believed they were being watched not just by leaders, but by forces beyond the physical world. Superstition was weaponized. Doubt became dangerous. Silence became survival. Inside the group, discipline was absolute, hierarchies were rigid, and commands were rarely explained. Questioning leadership was framed as weakness. Weakness was framed as treason. Punishments were public within the group and often brutal, serving as warnings to others. Beatings, mutilations, and executions were not acts of rage. They were instructional events designed to reinforce order. Mathare proved to be the ideal environment for this form of control. Dense population, narrow alleys, and constant movement made disappearance easy and accountability impossible. A member who violated internal rules could vanish overnight. By morning, rumors would circulate, but no bodies would be found. The uncertainty itself was the message. Leaving Mungiki was never discussed as an option. From the moment of initiation, the narrative was clear. Membership was for life, and life belonged to the group. Former members who attempted to distance themselves were treated as existential threats. They carried secrets. They embodied defiance. Allowing one person to leave without consequence risked unraveling the entire structure. Death, therefore, was not punishment. It was policy. What made this system particularly effective was its fusion of fear and belonging. Many members joined as teenagers, estranged from their families, already hardened by poverty and violence. Mungiki offered them brotherhood, purpose, and protection. The same structure that nurtured them also trapped them. Love and terror became indistinguishable. The psychological grip extended beyond members to the wider community. Residents of Mathare quickly learned that interacting with Mungiki required strict adherence to unspoken rules. Refusing to pay extortion was dangerous. Speaking to police was suicidal. Even acknowledging fear openly could attract suspicion. Entire neighborhoods became complicit through silence, not because they supported Mungiki, but because survival demanded compliance. The state's response only deepened this captivity. Police operations targeting Mungiki were often indiscriminate, violent, and corrupt. Innocent residents were beaten or killed. Suspected members were executed without trial. These actions validated Mungiki's warnings about the outside world. The message to members was clear: leaving would not bring safety. It would bring death from all sides. Some defectors did try to escape. A handful fled Nairobi entirely, disappearing into rural areas or crossing borders. Others attempted to cooperate with authorities, believing protection would follow. Few survived long. Stories circulated of former members found beheaded, their bodies displayed as warnings. In some cases, only their heads were found. In others, nothing at all. The absence of closure reinforced fear more effectively than spectacle. Inside the group, these killings were justified as cleansing. Betrayers were framed as contaminants threatening the collective. Executions were ritualized, stripped of personal emotion. Killing was not revenge, it was maintenance. This normalization of death further desensitized members, binding them deeper into the cycle. Once someone had participated in violence, leaving became psychologically impossible. Guilt turned into loyalty. Blood became contract. By the early 2000s, Mungiki had perfected a system in which control did not rely on constant force, but on internalized terror. Members policed themselves. Communities enforced silence. The group could operate invisibly and efficiently, expanding its influence across transport routes and informal economies in Nairobi and beyond. This chapter of Mungiki's evolution reveals its most dangerous feature. It is not held together by charisma or ideology alone, but by fear engineered to feel eternal. Once someone enters, the cost of leaving outweighs the cost of staying, no matter how violent staying becomes. Death is not just the consequence of betrayal, it is the foundation of obedience. Understanding this system is essential to understanding why Mungiki persists despite crackdowns, arrests, and public outrage. You cannot dismantle an organization when its members believe escape is worse than death. You cannot rehabilitate individuals who believe their lives ended the moment they joined. And you cannot break silence in a community where speaking is treated as a death sentence. This is the point where Mungiki stops being a group and becomes a prison without walls. A prison enforced not by bars, but by belief, fear, and blood. By the time Mungiki's internal system of loyalty and fear was fully established, violence had ceased to be a reaction. It became a language. What the outside world would later describe as senseless brutality was, inside the group, a carefully calibrated form of communication. Every act of violence carried meaning. Every killing delivered a message. And no method spoke louder than beheading. In neighborhoods like Mathare, violence had always existed, but Mungiki transformed it into theater. Executions were not hidden mistakes or private punishments. They were performances staged for maximum psychological impact. A body left in a public space was not meant only for the victim's family. It was meant for everyone who walked past it. The goal was not death itself, but what death could do to the living. Mungiki understood something fundamental about power in spaces abandoned by the state. Fear travels faster than law. A single act, if brutal enough, could silence an entire community. A single head displayed in the right place could secure obedience from hundreds without another word being spoken. Violence became governance. Beheading in particular carried deep symbolic weight. It was final, unmistakable, and culturally resonant. It stripped the victim of identity, erased individuality, and reduced the body to a warning. In some cases, heads were placed on roadsides, hung from poles, or left near transport routes controlled by the group. These were not random locations. They were strategic points of circulation where drivers, commuters, and residents would be forced to see and remember. The message was always the same, even when unspoken. This is what happens when you defy us, betray us, or speak to the wrong people. As Mungiki expanded beyond Mathare into other parts of Nairobi, violence became the tool that unified distant territories under a single authority. Not every area required constant enforcement. Some needed only a reminder. Rumors of executions traveled through informal networks faster than any official warning. Fear filled the gaps where Mungiki was not physically present. This strategy reached its most visible and devastating form during periods of national tension. The post-election crisis of 2007 did not create Mungiki's violence, but it amplified its utility. Political instability fractured already weak institutions, creating opportunities for armed groups to act with near-total impunity. In this chaos, Mungiki's capacity for organized terror became an asset, both to itself and to those who sought to manipulate unrest without appearing directly responsible. During this period, violence was no longer confined to internal discipline or local control. It became political. Communities perceived as hostile, disloyal, or strategically valuable were targeted. Beheadings and mutilations were used to terrorize populations into submission or displacement. Roads became boundaries. Neighborhoods became front lines. The distinction between criminal enforcement and political intimidation blurred completely. What made this violence so effective was not only its brutality, but its predictability. Mungiki did not kill impulsively. It followed patterns. Certain offenses produced certain outcomes. Refusing to pay extortion, interfering with transport operations, or collaborating with police carried known consequences. This consistency transformed fear into routine. People adjusted their behavior not because they were constantly threatened, but because they understood the rules. For the wider public, media coverage reduced Mungiki to a spectacle of horror. Headlines focused on severed heads and ritual killings, often stripping the violence of context. But inside Mathare and other affected areas, the meaning was clear. Violence was not chaos, it was order imposed through terror. The Kenyan state responded with force, but rarely with precision. Police raids escalated, often resulting in extrajudicial killings of suspected members. Bodies were dumped, families were left without answers. These actions did little to dismantle Mungiki's structure, and much to reinforce its narrative. Each unlawful killing by security forces confirmed what the group had long claimed, that the state did not value the lives of the poor and would never protect them. Caught between two violent powers, residents learned to survive by navigating fear carefully. Silence became a skill. Neutrality became impossible. Even mourning had to be measured. Public grief could be interpreted as protest. Private anger could be overheard. Entire communities internalized caution as instinct. For Mungiki members, participating in violence deepened loyalty. Killing was not only an act of enforcement, it was a rite of passage. Once someone crossed that line, return became impossible. The act tied them permanently to the group. Guilt became dependence. Dependence became obedience. Violence ensured that even those who wanted to leave could not imagine a life beyond it. Over time, the spectacle of violence achieved its ultimate goal. It reduced the need for violence itself. Control became ambient. People complied before being asked. Payments were made on time. Routes were respected. The absence of blood did not indicate peace. It indicated success. This is the paradox of terror as governance. When it works, it becomes invisible. The streets appear calm. Life continues. But beneath the surface, every movement is shaped by memory. Memory of what happened to those who forgot who ruled. By the time Mungiki's dominance was openly acknowledged at the national level, its system was already deeply entrenched. Violence had done its work, fear had become infrastructure, and the cost of dismantling that system would prove far higher than anyone was willing to pay. This chapter marks the moment when Mungiki ceased to be merely feared and became unavoidable. Not because it was everywhere, but because the memory of its violence was. The beheadings were not just acts of cruelty, they were signatures. And once a signature is recognized, it no longer needs to be written again. Terror alone does not sustain power. Fear can open the door, but something else must keep it from closing. For Mungiki, that something was money, not in the abstract sense of wealth, but in the practical control of everyday survival. What transformed the group from a feared sect into an enduring force was its mastery of the informal economy. Mungiki did not merely terrorize communities, it organized them around extraction. In places like Mathare, the economy does not run through banks or official contracts. It runs through access to water, access to electricity, access to transport, access to protection. Each of these elements, when monopolized, becomes a lever of power. Mungiki understood this early and built an economic system that mirrored the state while bypassing it entirely. Water was one of the first resources to be captured. In informal settlements, clean water is scarce, and distribution is often illegal by default. Pipes run above ground, vulnerable to interference. Mungiki controlled networks determined who received water, when, and at what price. Families who paid were supplied. Those who resisted found their access cut without warning. In a slum where water is life, this control was absolute. Electricity followed a similar pattern. Illegal connections were organized, maintained, and guarded. Payments were collected weekly. Those who failed to comply risked not only darkness, but violence. Fires caused by faulty wiring were common, yet residents continued to pay because the alternative was worse. Mungiki became the utility provider where the state had failed to operate. But it was the transport sector that elevated the group's power beyond the boundaries of Mathare. Nairobi's matatu system is the bloodstream of the city, moving millions daily through loosely regulated routes. Control of these routes meant control of cash flow, employment, and movement. Mungiki imposed taxes on drivers, conductors, and vehicle owners. Compliance ensured protection from vandalism or attack. Resistance invited swift punishment. These payments were not random extortion. They were standardized, predictable, and enforced consistently. This predictability gave the system a twisted legitimacy. Drivers factored the cost into their daily earnings. Passengers unknowingly paid into the system through increased fares. The money flowed upward through disciplined hierarchies, funding operations, weapons, and loyalty. Protection rackets extended beyond transport. Market vendors, shop owners, landlords, even funeral organizers were taxed. Mungiki's reach seeped into moments of life and death alike. Weddings, burials, and community events required approval or payment. In exchange, violence was withheld. Peace was rented, not guaranteed. This economic control reinforced fear in a way violence alone could not. When people depend on you to drink, to travel, to work, and to bury their dead, resistance becomes irrational. The threat is no longer abstract. It is immediate and personal. Losing access means losing dignity. Losing dignity in a place like Mathare often means losing life. As Mungiki's financial system expanded, so did its political relevance. Money buys influence, and influence buys protection. Local officials were pressured or bribed. Police officers were paid to look away. Intelligence about upcoming raids was sometimes leaked in advance. This did not require formal alliances, only mutual convenience. Corruption blurred the line between criminality and governance. The state once again responded with force rather than reform. Crackdowns targeted visible members, but rarely disrupted the economic networks sustaining them. Arresting individuals did not dismantle systems. New enforcers replaced the old. Payments continued uninterrupted. The illusion of action satisfied public outrage while leaving the structure intact. For residents, the distinction between Mungiki and the government became increasingly meaningless. Both demanded payment. Both enforced compliance through fear. Both appeared suddenly and violently. The difference was that Mungiki delivered services consistently, however brutally. The state did not. This is how a criminal organization becomes embedded, not by conquering territory with constant bloodshed, but by integrating itself into the routines of daily life. When extortion becomes normalized, resistance feels abnormal. When fear becomes predictable, it becomes manageable. Survival adjusts around it. The invisible economy also locked members deeper into the system. Those who collected payments, enforced rules, or managed routes became financially dependent on Mungiki. Leaving meant losing income, protection, and identity. Worse, it meant becoming a liability, someone who knew too much about how the system worked. Economic dependence reinforced the death sentence attached to defection. Beyond Mathare, these systems extended into other neighborhoods and regions around Nairobi. What began as slum-based extortion evolved into a citywide shadow economy. Each new area followed the same pattern: identify unmet needs, monopolize access, enforce compliance, extract payment, and silence dissent. By this stage, Mungiki no longer needed to rely heavily on spectacle violence. The infrastructure of fear was complete. Money flowed quietly. Control was maintained efficiently. Communities complied not because they were constantly threatened, but because they were constantly dependent. This economic dimension explains why dismantling Mungiki proved so difficult. You cannot remove a group without replacing the functions it performs. Destroying the organization without addressing the vacuum it filled only invites another to take its place. Mathare had already learned this lesson the hard way. Power, once established through terror, was sustained through necessity. Mungiki did not just rule through fear. It ruled through bills, routes, pipes, cables, and cash, through the mundane mechanisms of survival, through the invisible economy that touches every life but leaves no official record. This chapter reveals the uncomfortable truth at the heart of the story. Mungiki survived not only because it was violent, but because it was useful. And as long as entire communities are forced to survive outside the protection of the state, usefulness will always be more powerful than legitimacy. For those who enter Mungiki, the idea of leaving is introduced only once, at the beginning, and only as a warning. From that moment on, it is never discussed again. Silence replaces choice. Fear replaces future. By the time a member begins to imagine escape, the consequences are already understood. Leaving is not an action, it is a sentence. Defectors are not viewed as individuals seeking freedom. They are treated as existential threats. A former member carries knowledge, names, routes, rituals, payment systems, hierarchies. Allowing that knowledge to exist outside the group risks collapse from within. For Mungiki, mercy is not weakness, it is danger. Death, therefore, becomes the only acceptable conclusion. Those who attempt to leave do so quietly. There are no announcements, no farewells. Some simply stop showing up, hoping invisibility will protect them. Others flee Mathare entirely, disappearing into rural villages or distant towns, severing contact with family to avoid being traced. A few seek help from the state, believing that cooperation might grant protection. Almost all of them are wrong. Stories circulate in whispers. A man seen boarding a bus one morning is never seen again. A body discovered days later without a head. A family warned not to ask questions. These stories are never confirmed publicly, yet everyone knows them. The lack of official acknowledgement only deepens their power. Fear thrives in uncertainty. For those who go to the police, the outcome is rarely safety. Some officers are compromised, others lack resources or will. Protection programs are weak or non-existent. Once a defector is identified, information leaks. Sometimes the warning comes too late. Sometimes it does not come at all. In this way, the state becomes an unreliable refuge, reinforcing the belief that escape is an illusion. Even when defectors survive physically, they rarely escape psychologically. Years of indoctrination do not dissolve with distance. The fear of spiritual punishment, of ancestral curses, of inevitable retribution lingers. Some former members report constant paranoia, believing they are being followed even when they are not. Others suffer nightmares, guilt, and profound isolation. Leaving Mungiki does not restore freedom. It replaces one prison with another. Communities, too, participate in enforcing this silence. Residents of Mathare have learned that asking questions can be fatal. Offering shelter to a defector is interpreted as collaboration. Families may disown relatives, not out of hatred, but out of fear. Survival requires distance. Love becomes a liability. This collective silence is not accidental. It is the final layer of control. When communities police themselves, the organization no longer needs to be omnipresent. Fear does the work alone. A defector cannot hide in a place where everyone understands the cost of helping them. Over time, this system creates a closed cycle. Young men join seeking protection or income. They are bound through oaths and violence. They become enforcers. They realize too late that leaving is impossible. Some accept this reality and climb the hierarchy. Others resist internally, growing resentful and unstable. A few attempt escape and vanish. Their fate reinforces the rule. The cycle continues. This is why crackdowns, arrests, and executions have failed to dismantle Mungiki. Removing individuals does not dismantle belief. Killing leaders does not erase fear. As long as the conditions that created the group remain, abandonment, poverty, corruption, and lack of protection, the logic of Mungiki remains intact. Mathare is central to this conclusion. The slum did not just give birth to the organization, it continues to sustain it. When the state is absent, power does not vanish. It reorganizes. When law collapses, fear becomes governance. And when fear governs long enough, it becomes normal. The tragedy is that Mungiki does not need to win forever. It only needs to outlast alternatives. Each failed reform, each corrupt official, each violent police operation that targets communities instead of systems strengthens the narrative that no one else can rule. In that narrative, death becomes the price of disobedience, and obedience becomes the price of survival. For defectors, there is no redemption arc. There are no public testimonies, no rehabilitation stories celebrated on television. Their absence is the story. Their silence is the warning. Their deaths, when they occur, are rarely named, but they are remembered, not as victims, but as proof. This is the final truth of Mungiki's power. It is not maintained by constant killing, but by the certainty that killing will occur if necessary. It is not enforced only by machetes, but by memory, and it is not sustained only by ideology or money, but by the shared understanding that there is no exit. Leaving only happens through death, not because death is inevitable, but because the system has been engineered to make every other option feel impossible. And as long as places like Nairobi continue to contain neighborhoods where survival depends on fear rather than rights, this story will not end with Mungiki. Another name will emerge, another structure will rise, another generation will learn the same lesson. The documentary does not end with closure because Mathare has not found one. It ends with a warning. When a society abandons its margins, something will rule them, and once fear becomes the law, leaving the law becomes a